Am I audible at the back?
One second, let them sit down. Let them sit down.
Mr. Speaker, the central line that government is running in this particular debate is that emotions make you do bad things, right? Emotions make you do horrible things at the times of war. Soldiers with emotions are extremely problematic because soldiers with extreme emotions lead to war crimes, right? Today we're going to show you how we're going to make war less emotional and we're going to reduce the collateral on both sides. And that's what we're going to talk to you about, mainly four things. First, what are war crimes and what role emotion plays in war crimes. Second, how this makes prosecution of war crimes much more easier. Third, why are there more consensuous objectives on our side? And finally, why this requires the generals or the commanders to give clearer orders, which is good in the long run. First, if we move in the first direction, first, what are war crimes, right? We define that war crimes are of two particular types. First is to advance a particular strategic objective in a particular manner. And the second one is purely motivated by an emotional desire to just fuck shit up, right? During a particular time, and that's exactly what we're running through, right? Even though both of these war crimes are, and I'll get back to you later, both these war crimes are of a different natures. They're particularly colored because of the emotional baggage that a soldier has to go through during the time of the war. War is a time of chaos, of hatred, of people going around killing each other, of people going around maiming each other, and every emotion and every act that a soldier does is colored by the emotional baggage that he accumulates. I'll take you later. Is colored by the emotional baggage that he accumulates during this particular type of warfare, and that is what we believe gets reduced through our model. And basically this is, we'll remove every vestige of emotion from that particular soldier, and we're only talking about soldiers on the front lines, right? Only talking about soldiers who actually do war, who actually fight physically with other soldiers, and we're not talking about the commanders, we're not talking about the majors that are sitting at the back or in their offices. We'll take you later. Majors that are sitting at the back and majors in their offices, we're only talking about the soldiers in their front line. We say that these soldiers in their front lines are motivated to commit war crimes because of the fact that their emotions are running so high, particularly after a war, that they cannot, they make decisions that at that particular moment they might feel right, but which are incorrect and unethical in the long run. We say that when we remove these emotions from the soldiers and we hardwire in them a code of ethics, we hardwire in them the fact that there have to be certain laws of war which have to be followed in all particular scenarios. We submit that as soon as we remove the emotional baggage from them and hardwire this particular code of ethics, they will not be motivated to do extreme actions, right? A soldier who has been told and who does not have any emotion telling him otherwise, who's been hardwired that there are certain ethics with which you should not rape innocent women, innocent children after a war, will practically not do so, because what motivation does he have in a world where that soldier does not even have any emotion telling him to do? It's basically someone doing a job, and people who are indifferent towards other people don't simply go around raping them, murdering them for no particular reason. Which brings me to my second point. No, I'll take you later. Why this makes prosecution of war crimes easier. The classic problem with prosecution of any sort of war crime is whether the soldier was acting under orders by the commander or of his own volition. This is the primary line of defense that is taken by many commanders, which in fact, where they basically say that the soldier is acting of his own volition, of his own emotion, and I basically have no hand in this particular scenario. We say that as soon as you remove the emotional element, these soldiers are the only people who are acting according to the orders of their commanders, and in fact this would make the link of traceability much easier between the acts of the soldier and the orders that are given by the commander. Because as soon as you remove the emotional element, the soldier is not raping. It's clear that the soldier is not raping people of their own volition because he's been given orders, right? Which brings me to my third point. And third point is, why are there more conscientious objectives on our side? This is the primary line that the opposition is going to be running, that people who have emotions will object to doing war crimes. We say that first, that does not happen in their paradigm. People committed war crimes in World War War II, people committed war crimes after Vietnam, and that's because normal soldiers can, in their paradigm, in the status quo, can't simply stand up to their commanders and say, no, I'm not going to do this. They're gonna get court-martialed, they're gonna get murdered, and in fact, fear in this particular scenario complicates the soldiers becoming conscientious objectives, because these soldiers obviously fear for their own lives, fear for their own families, know that dissent against the orders given by the commanders will cause them severe damage, and it is this fear which leads to less conscientious objectives on their side. Whereas a soldier which does not have any emotions but merely a code of ethics and laws of ethics, if a commander tells that particular soldier that you have to do something, you have to rape innocent women, that is exactly against his code of ethics, that soldier will obviously object at that particular scenario and will not do that, and he will, because he does not have any fear whatsoever, and he's been hardwired that this cornerstone, which is the code of ethics and following the laws of war that he must follow in this particular scenario, that he's been hardwired that under all scenarios that there are certain things, that lines that you must not cross. As soon as an order comes to him which crosses him to makes him cross, under which the general is asking that soldier to cross those lines, the soldier is going to object, which means that ethics in this scenario will not be complicated by the emotional baggage or the fear that the soldier has, right? And which brings me to my fourth before that I take.
I'll ask you.
Cool. This brings me to my fourth point, right? Why this gives you the requirement of clearer orders, right? Clearer orders. We submit that, again, certain orders with regards to war crime are given with regards to strategy, and they're given rather vaguely, right? Induce fear, induce do this, do this. Now we say that this, in our paradigm, two things happen. First, a soldier which has to induce fear will obviously have a particular code of ethics and will not basically, in his actions will not be colored by the emotions that he has accrued throughout the war. Second, the soldier who, in fact, if he does not feel any emotion, will not know how to induce fear. This gives the requirement of clearer order. Before that I take.
So if you're saying that your commanders will still have emotions, and therefore the decisions that will be taken will be as emotionally charged, how are you materially affecting outcomes?
We say that the reason that the outcomes are going to be materially affected is because these orders who give these bad orders will definitely be prosecuted for war crimes, and this prosecution for war crimes is going to be made much more easier because the inherent defense against war crimes, which is that the soldier is acting of his own volition, or the soldier is acting of his own of his own feelings or emotions accrued during that war, will not exist, right? That particular major defense will not exist, and that is why because again a soldier without emotions will not know what to do when given vague orders like induce fear or do this particular thing, or so he'll have to be given particular orders regarding go rape 50 women, go do this particular thing, go murder 800 people, and this requirement of particular orders helps in two ways. First, it brings traceability, and it brings traceability and increases the chances of prosecution. And in our scenario, definitely this will lead to a reduction of war crimes, increased prosecution of war crimes, more scrutiny, and easy traceability, and which is why we think we're proud to propose this.
Thank the Prime Minister has changed the event in the case of South.
Guys, both benches, be really loud when you ask to be like, so that people are calling it back. For sure. Yeah. Okay.
The chair. Okay. Mr. Speaker, before I move on to present side opposition's case in this debate, I'll offer a few pointed rebuttals. First, Gov's characterization in this debate has been that war crimes are the result of emotion and that soldiers who are emotionally charged end up committing war crimes. We challenge that. We think a lot of the times war crimes are strategies to silence local population. They are orders that come from the top brass. They are strategic ways in which you can keep local population suppressed. Rape, pillage or murder civilians in conflict, right? We think all of this may well be the result of top brass telling them to do things and not necessarily the product of a soldier's emotions, right? Second, and two incoherent arguments when it comes to modeling, right? They say that they're going to remove emotions and they're going to instill a code of ethics in soldiers. We don't see how that can happen if the soldier is not emotional. If the soldier is not a blank slate who you can write ethics into, which means how is that person instilling a code to guide him into action, and how is that code translating into him applying these two conflict situations, right? We don't think how that can happen. Secondly, they talk to you about this idea that commanders have emotions while soldiers shouldn't. I mean, unless they have somehow a magical way of giving back emotions to soldiers who then become commanders, we see that as incoherent modeling. I'm going to talk to you about 4 arguments on side opposition, right? First, I'm going to talk to you about the role of emotions and how it's necessary that emotions guided by morality are important for soldiers. Second, I'm going to tell you who are more likely to be soldiers and why not having emotions is problematic for them. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about how it's necessary that violence in conflict situations be tempered with emotions and how emotional decision making is necessary to prevent destructive violence. And fourthly, why sacrifice and comradeship that arises from emotion is important. First, understand that morality is guided by emotion. Soldiers, like most all human beings, are not born with inborn systems of morality, which means morality is something that we derive out of lived experiences, how we live and rationalize from our environment. Which means if you want to instill that code of ethics that you want to in soldiers, that government seems to be doing, it is not possible unless you instill them a sense of emotion, because that emotion in how you perceive your immediate circumstances is what makes you a moral individual, right? But understand the nature of conflict today, right? Today, conflict doesn't happen on the front lines in two soldiers in trenches, two groups of soldiers in trenches. Today, conflict happens in cities where there are civilian lives at stake, where armies are intertwined with civilians and how you navigate that conflict. The purpose of warfare is not in the sense of invasion or huge land armies going against each other. These could be strategic situations like say the villages of Afghanistan where you have to flush out terrorists or guerrilla warfare, right? All of this means that civilians will necessarily be a part of that conflict. Now, if you want to hold territory and connect to civilians and build assets in territories, we think it's important that you understand this, the nature of their lived experiences and how civilians in these territories behave, right? Because understand this, a robot, a soldier who's not guided by emotions is not likely to be responded to by civilians, right? They need to be empathetic individuals who understand the circumstances, interact with them, and thus build a local population that will serve that invading army's needs, right? So take the example of the US Marines, right? They invaded Afghanistan and went away, right? It's the Green Berets who built that attachment with the local population, held territory, built assets, and empathized with locals. We think that's important because for an invasion to work, for you to hold territory, it's important that you talk to locals in that terrain, right? But then let me move on to my next argument, that of understand that the armies today, of course, may have full service commissioned soldiers who are part of the standing army, but they may also be short service individuals who are going back to civilian territory after war and serve only intermittently during wartime. We think when all of these people come back, they become misfits in society, right? Because once you take emotions from them, they don't remain fully functioning individuals, right? Which means you've hampered their progress in society, because you need to see them as not just soldiers, they're individuals with lives, with families, with their own lives to live. We think once you dehumanize these people and take away their emotions, you make them less than full functioning individuals. We think that's an intrinsic harm, given that we want individuals to be emotional and fully functioning. Third, let me move on to what happens when modern armies engage in conflict, right? We think modern armies today are more goal-oriented and they will use the most optimum ways to achieve strategic outcomes. Take Nagasaki for example. The strategic goal of stopping the war early was more important than considering the lives of civilians who lost their lives due to the bombs being dropped on them. We think once you take away emotion from soldiers and once you remove the role of emotion from decision making, what ends up happening is that soldiers will only try to achieve these strategic objectives given the orders that the top brass has given them, which means they will only use those strategic ways to achieve those outcomes. The problem with that is that they will only kill individuals or use the most violent ways of achieving their objectives, right? Because they will be goal oriented, which means they won't consider the lives of civilians who will be compromised in such a bargain, right? We think it's important to consider civilians emotionally and consider how your strategic objectives affect civilians in conflict situations, right? Take Kashmir for example, right? While you're flushing out terrorists, it's important to consider how your moves affect civilians, and only an emotional soldier who is in touch with what civilians want and how their lives are is most likely to respond to that situation in the manner that I just described. But thirdly, let's understand that the nature of war is that it's an extremely charged atmosphere, right? Which means soldiers are guided by what? Because they are in that charged situation. Which means if they are given orders to kill soldiers or commit violence on the other side, they will not be able to make reasoned decisions as to what they should be doing. Which means if the top brass tells them to slaughter a bunch of civilians crossing any kind of territory, this violence will not be tempered with their own decision making, which necessarily evolves from emotion. We think that's important because at times soldiers need to step up and decide that it's not okay to kill civilians and follow orders all the time. We also think that if they want to make soldiers more efficient, if that is a goal they see on their side, they need to consider that soldiers show extraordinary bravery in times of war, the kinds of sacrifices they make. All of this happens for emotional reasons. So that patriotism is not a rational consideration. It only exists because they are fighting for the greater good. They see something larger than themselves. Once you put them in conflict situations, and these are self-interested individuals we're talking about, even if they are emotionless, they will achieve suboptimal outcomes because they're not as driven to fight in the absence of emotion. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to extend the case to Side Government here.
Is this audible at the back? Yeah? Mr. Speaker, the only case we can deduce from the Tello speech is that sometimes there may be good emotions in war, and those good emotions in war may lead to soldiers doing good things, which is why they don't understand the way emotional responses to war work. Because what really is the context of war, right? We tell you war involves an insane amount of bloodshed, the loss of life, the loss of people who went through military training with, and the loss of life of people who you really close friends with. It involves an acknowledgement of your own mortality, given the way you see people dropping like flies around you. There's carnage, there's ruin, there's damage around you. You see property, lives, societies being ruined. We tell you that in that context, all emotional responses are colored and informed by the immediate surroundings of that particular individual, which is why we think proximity to these circumstances becomes incredibly important, which is where we think that POI on the idea that commanders are still going to be emotional is a misguided POI, because we say that yes, commanders will still have emotions, but their emotions are not going to be colored by these immediate surroundings, because commanders don't stand in the middle of a ruin and watch people die. They sit in fancy tents and make strategic decisions, which means which means, Mr. Speaker, that when we look at the people we're talking about in this debate, which is soldiers, in the context of war in which they are, which is bloodshed and destruction, we tell you this is more likely to bring out negative emotions than positive ones in almost all circumstances. We tell you, for every soldier who's in war, who's surrounded by death and destruction, it's more likely that he's going to experience negative emotions and attach a negative emotional filter to his actions than he's going to attach positive emotions or attach a positive emotional filter to his actions. What are the consequences of this? And we told you about war crimes. We told you how war crimes are often purely emotional responses, purely emotional ways of channeling the kind of anger and frustration you felt during the war onto a powerless victim. But their response to that has been that very often war crimes are a matter of strategy. But we tell you that response is misguided, because even when war crimes are a matter of strategy, and even when it's instructed to you by the top brass to commit certain actions or to commit certain war crimes, we tell you the manner in which that command is carried out often takes on a magnitude of brutality because of the emotions involved in that a soldier feels. What does that mean? That means that the top brass may tell a soldier to neutralize a particular political leader in a particular village. The soldier could do that by going and killing the people there, or he could do that by burning the entire village down. We tell you that when soldiers feel emotions of death or negative emotions in the context of death and destruction and mortality, they're more likely to act in those extreme manners, and for their action and for these strategic objectives to be carried out in a manner which is much more brutal, in a manner which is much more destructive. Which means even if certain war crimes continue to happen because the strategic commands, we tell you they happen in a better way on our side than they happen on their side. But we tell you mostly they don't happen at all because they're very often purely emotional responses. Let's deal with other things they said. They said you really can't just write a code of ethics into a person. That's not how people work. But we tell you people still need a decision-making metric and a system to decide what they're going to do. We tell you right now, people's metric, while rationality plays a part in it, also involves emotions as a huge factor they consider in making those decisions. We tell you the moment you take emotions out of it, all that's left is within that soldier is a code of ethics, is a model of behavior that has been hardwired into him through years and years of military training. Right? They tell you that all morality is derived from emotion, and we tell you that's the problem, because we tell you negative emotions are bad because then they end up affecting these soldiers' morality, and these soldiers then do war crimes. We're not giving this guy a moral or a morality, we're giving him a set of rules. We're hardwiring the fact that you cannot kill civilians, that you cannot kill unarmed people, that you cannot do X, Y, and Z. We're hardwiring the Geneva Convention into this person, and we're hoping he abides by this hardwired Geneva Convention. That's the code of ethics which Karan Dhalla talked to you about, which BT did not understand. The other thing they say is that soldiers are going to make colder decisions, and that's a bad thing. We tell you one, when there are no non-combatants on the battlefield, we're okay with soldiers making colder decisions and making more rational decisions, which means when it's just the Indian army versus the Pakistani army with no non-combatants, we're okay with the Indian army choosing to carpet bomb the Pakistani army instead of going there and individually killing them one by one. But we tell you where non-combatants exist, the soldiers are still going to follow the hardwired codes of ethics, right? Which means the soldiers are still going to follow the principle that they have to minimize collateral damage, are still going to follow the principle that they cannot take innocent lives, right? We tell you that in the absence of emotions, the only thing they act upon is what we tell them to act upon. And if for 4 years of rigorous military training we feed the Geneva Convention into the heads of the soldier, we tell you we can guarantee that that soldier is not going to act in ways contrary to the Geneva Convention. The next thing they say is that conflicts happen in cities and therefore you need civilian support. One, factually untrue. It's not like some Call of Duty modern warfare war that's going out there where every war happens in cities. These wars often happen in really deserted, remote areas in the Middle East and in the theaters of war right now where there isn't a lot of population. But even where you need to build civilian support, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that emotions don't lead to the kind of empathy and rainbows that Amandeep talks about. We tell you that in that context of death, these negative emotions lead you to treat these villagers who you need to build crucial support with in incredibly poor ways. It's the emotional response in American Marines which leads them to treat all Arabs as the enemy and therefore not cooperate with villagers in the region, therefore hate people in the region even if they're innocent people, because we tell you that crimes against villagers in Iraq happened because people felt this emotion of disgust towards a particular race of people, right? We tell you if we want to build civilian support, it's better if we send robots to build civilian support than we send people to build civilian support whose friends are being killed by the people they need to build that civilian support with, right? Which is why we tell you that civilian support is better on our side. Last thing they say, veterans are going to be misfits because you don't give them back their emotions. They will give them back their emotions, but assuming the technology exists, no part of PM speech or the motion said we're never giving them these emotions back. Go.
You are saying that the soldiers will be able to not hurt people because they don't have emotions. But often, like, I mean, my point is, if you've been asked to murder, rape and pillage and that's your command, how exactly will that be moderated owing to lack of emotions? Can you just talk about the outcome?
The reason that will be moderated due to a lack of emotions is because when through 4 years of military training, the core personal decision-making metric that's being fed to this person is a certain convention, is a certain code of ethics. We tell you that like fear from backlash because I don't follow my commander's orders is not something that exists. The reason you don't get conscientious objectives in status quo is because they're afraid that if they don't follow their orders, their commanders are gonna nail their life. We tell you that in a world where people don't feel fear and they get a command saying go rape, murder and pillage, they'll say that's not a command I have to follow, that's a command contrary to the rules of war. I don't fear what backlash may happen, I don't fear being called a bad guy, I will object it. We tell you that that's what happens in this world. People are more willing to object to those kinds of commands, right? But we tell you, Mr. Speaker, what's very important is the kind of political discourse that surrounds the military, because very often criticism of the military is avoided to keep up the morale of the soldiers. At the point in time that emotions are out of the window and therefore soldiers' morale is out of the window, Mr. Speaker, we tell you it's easier to criticize the military in national political discourse. We think the consequences of this are greater accountability on the military, are greater focus, greater discussion about military practices. We think that leads to better war in the future. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case beside opposition. You're here.
And begin. Can I start? Alright, Madam Speaker, first off, a very few fundamental clarifications. The commanding officer of a platoon is always on the field. The commanding, wait Mainak, I'll tell you why that's important. You can trivialize me later. The commanding officer of a battalion is generally on the field. Even if it's an Air Force, he's watching the battle go on live. So the entire assertion about how the commander does not see the damage and the brutality of the war, and therefore his decision-making matrix would not be affected because he has emotions but there's nothing to affect his emotions, is complete bullshit. Because when his men come back from the battlefield and then he gets to see that there are 15 amputees and 13 of them missing an arm and I don't know whatnot of their body, he gets to see all of that, Madam Speaker. So he's equally likely to get affected as a soldier. And the distinction that they have made in this debate, which the motion honestly doesn't allow them to, has actually screwed them, and I'll deal with it later, right? But first off, this clarification is important to be noted, right? Secondly, this entire mischaracterization that they have brought out about war crimes. Understand this, right? A divine soldier deciding to go murder, rape or pillage by himself against the orders that he's been given is not a war crime. That is a soldier who will probably be court-martialed and will be hung. But because he did not follow the orders that was given to him, which was to maintain the ethical standards. That's your standard army. That individual soldier cannot commit war crime. That's not the definition of war crime in this Geneva Convention that they seem to be quoting time and again. A war crime, like we said, is a strategic decision, if not strategic, a decision taken collectively at the level of the command to go down and silence people, and in order to silence them and scare them into submission, do things that should not be done to human beings, right? Now, in that situation, they seem to be wavering on whether their stance is that a soldier, owing to lack of emotions, will be committing the crime or not committing the crime with, at all, or committing the crime with lesser amount of intensity. They haven't given us a clear stance, and I will deal with this argument as to why that's not really the case and as to how the soldier is more likely to commit war crime in case he doesn't have his own sense of emotion at a later point. But again, the clarification is important to know. Again, the comparison between Indian Army and Pakistani Army facing each other off is something that puts their case in the age of conventional warfare where armies are
facing each other. We're not saying that battles happen in cities, Madam Speaker. We're simply saying that they happen in our backyards with collateral damage being an existing reality. Where you're not facing another armed forces. You're facing a human barrier behind which you're facing non-state actors who you don't know if they're humans or combatants, and then you're facing real combatants. In that situation, the person who defines the definition of the other is not the emotion of the individual soldier. It's important to understand that the definition of the other is defined by the commander, and the soldiers in their situation where they are obedient simply follow it. And if they follow the definition of the other as defined by their commanders, whether or not they are being ethical or moral or immoral is dependent on whether they are hurting the other or someone who's not the other. And therefore, again, it's not dependent on the soldier's inherent sense of morality as much as it is on the defined idea of who the other is, which anyways he can't control, which anyways, given that his commander is defining and is emotionally skewed, is still an emotional decision, right? Now the thing is, let's look at what exactly is this code of ethics that they have been talking about, right? The code of ethics, this Geneva Convention, or the entire Allied powers propaganda of human rights which came out after the World War II, is not an objective standard in the world of relative rights, right? It is defined politically in every war. Sit down, Mainak. It is defined politically in every war. More importantly, depending on whether you are in the supply forces or you are a marine on the front or you are going to parade drop, your sense of morality and your adherence to the Geneva Convention protocol is tempered, right? So basically, the person who has the biggest control about what your sense of morality is, and like Nigam conceded, is your commander, is your training school, Madam Speaker. And that depends on where you are in the army. If you're often in the front, you'll be going to that kind of a training school, and they'll be the ones telling you what your sense of morality is. And the only other thing, and this way I've been hinting at, which guides your sense of morality is the emotions that come in you, and therefore the lived experiences that you have in the application of this sense of ethics that is imbued in you by the training school. So now what Mainak would want soldiers to have, and probably that's up there, I'll take it later. What Mainak's team would have soldiers to have is basically they have this paradigm of ethics, but no basis on which they would learn from the application of this paradigm. So they'll be stuck there as to what it was defined by their training school. And as I've said before, things like war crime, given that they're structurally defined, often are decided at the top brass. So often soldiers won't be able to see the morally right from the morally wrong because they're incapable of individually assessing the situation based on reactions that are evoked in them, based on the emotions that are already intrinsic to them and are not defined by their military schooling, which at the end of the day defines their code of ethics, right? Now the thing, Madam Speaker, is this. When we talk about divines in a soldier, whether it's about him not following the orders of his superiors or him going simply deciding to rape and pillage, it's not a question of emotions, right? Disobedience is not a product of emotions. It's a very rational choice where the soldier decides to value his self-interest of either gratification or self-preservation over the interest of the army or over the interest of the code and honor that he's serving. And in that situation, we believe if there is no morality decided by his emotions to guide him, he's more likely to be a brutal actor by himself, regardless of the command that is given to him. And that, Madam Speaker, is owing to one reason that Amandeep brought out in front of you, which has not been successfully challenged. Which is apart from the code of ethics that is taught to you and defined to you artificially by your training school, which often is screwed up because it's politically guided, it's a propaganda, and often your superiors want you to believe in a culture of violence and war crimes. Apart from that, the only thing which guides your sense of morality is your emotions coming out of your lived experiences, and they haven't taken this down. And that's important in case of invasions, Madam Speaker, because when you're fighting in your backyards, it's important to invade and win the hearts of the people and thereby reduce damage. And that's the only way you can hold territory, that's the only way you can have a conclusive victory in modern war, where it's not just against other forces, it's also against other people. Moreover, Madam Speaker, we believe that the emotion of sacrifice is something which forces soldiers to stick on to honor the national narrative or the greater good which they want to do, in spite of it being completely against their self-interest. But at the end of the day, you're just taking away emotions from the person. You're not taking away a sense of self-preservation. And if he does not have the emotion of code and honor, he's unlikely to, in an extremely skewed dilemma, able to value greater good over his sense of self-preservation or self-interest. And lastly, Madam Speaker, we believe that if the commanders are emotional and take decisions in a certain way, and the men are not, and they are merely agents or machines, there will be a huge disconnect between the men and the commanders. And we are not going to deal with this more because I don't have time, but it's often not a good idea to have commanders to be a certain kind of human beings and men to be mere donkeys, because then you have greater issues of insubordination, greater disconnect between the two, and lesser flow of information and ideas. And for all of these reasons, we oppose. Thank you. Rudra also having taken a floor. We ask.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and invite the government whip to summarize the case beside something further.
Am I audible? Sorry, who's chairing? You are? What did you say, Madam Speaker?
10 minutes is stupid. 10 minutes is...
Okay, can I start? Mr. Speaker, the POI really wanted to ask them that they just wouldn't take was this simple POI, which is, on which side are you most likely to use unnecessary brutal force against civilians? The civilians you are indifferent to because you don't feel any particular emotion towards them, or the civilians you probably hate because you think that they're harboring enemies who are trying to kill your brothers and will probably kill you. We think it's obviously the former, and that's the question that they simply haven't answered through this debate. The problem is that when Rudro comes and tells you this lecture about like how war works and etc., he still cannot answer that very principled question of how a soldier behaves in the heat of the moment, when there are bullets being fired, when there are civilians in front of him who he thinks are often akin or supporters of enemy combatants. We don't think that soldiers treat them particularly well, and we think that's where a lot of abuse and a lot of crimes during war, if war crimes is not the legally technical term to use, happen. Second, we say, and a couple of rebuttals on this, on the idea of hardwiring, you can't do that. No, man. You said in first speech that these are like robots. Asimov came up with 3 rules for robots. We'll come up with 10 rules for these soldiers. We'll say, never, never rape women, never, never hurt children, even if that means killing yourself or dying. Never put the life of your own soldiers over the life of innocents out there. We'll come up with some other rules like that. Don't destroy property if you think that it can, if it's very important, you've been told not to destroy that property. We'll tell them that don't destroy like religious symbols if there is another way and an alternative available to kill the person in question. Don't attack people if they're using human shields. Don't carpet bomb people if there are civilians around. We don't understand why any of this requires a moral and a conscientious like evaluation of what is good and what is bad, and is the world going towards like the right direction and wrong direction, and where is Donald Trump leading us on. We don't think it requires all of that. It just requires you to adhere to simply, strictly given orders without bringing in your own emotions to it. Because the first question in this debate that you have to ask yourself is twofold. Are emotions good for war? And secondly, do we really want to trust every single soldier with his own colored lived experience, to use the word, with his individual morality when bullets are flying around him and people are trying to kill him? We don't want to do that. We would rather that they act as robots and follow orders strictly given by the people who are giving the orders, the commanders. And that's Rudro's main case. I know this debate is not about commanders. But listen, this debate is about people on front lines. And to the extent that a platoon commander is on front line, obviously he is not going to have any emotions. But you have to understand that technically in most democracies, the commander-in-chief is the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of India. Obviously, we are not supposed to defend the status where we are going to say that the commander-in-chief himself will not feel emotions. Basically, you are asking us to argue that the PM should not have emotions. Obviously, that's not our burden. Our burden is to simply defend this on the front line. So we say anybody who's on the front line need not have emotions. We think that people who don't have emotions, platoon commanders or whatever it might be, always take orders from those in strategic decisions or strategic posts. Like I'm talking about people sitting in Pentagon, I'm talking about people sitting in the Situation Room, if that exists in the Prime Minister's house in India, or whatever it is. We think that those people ought to have emotions. But we also think that in most cases of war crimes, this is coming to the kind of war crimes that Rudra was talking about, like genocide, like Omar al-Bashir for instance, he was the guy giving
giving orders out there. And he was the guy who told them to commit war crimes. He was a president. And you know how they do it? They don't do it with straight things. You will never hear Omar al-Bashir go and say, please go rape and commit genocide. He will do it through a twofold, very, very interesting measure. One, by giving vague orders like saying, use any means necessary to induce fear. And B, by giving psychological winks, like how Modi does it, right? When he says there should be a holiday or electricity on like Hindu festivals also. It's a psychological wink. He will tell you things like, terrorist supporters have no rights. We are okay to hate people who also kill our brothers in war. He will use terms like we think that the Hutu or the Tutsi community is inferior human beings. They're like monkeys. He will never tell you to actively rape them. But what he's banking on is your hatred. He is wanting you to make the orders for yourself because you hate them. He is telling you to do vague things and hopes that your hatred will take on and do that like real process that Rudro explained as to how emotions translate into action. He wants you to do that and translate your emotions of hatred, anger, fear, disgust into actions. That's the problem, and that's what we are trying to solve. Because and that's the clash they missed out, which is the second question. Why does prosecution become easier? Because now Omar al-Bashir cannot, sort of like depend on your own hatred to do his job for him. He has to come out and actually tell all the platoon commanders that I want you to rape women because that's going to scare the opposition forces. We think that's fine because on that side, A, Omar al-Bashir cannot later take the defense that my soldiers were acting out of their own volition, they weren't listening to me. B, Omar al-Bashir has to give clearer orders, and those clearer orders can be used in prosecution as better evidence than vaguer orders. 3, because these people, as by Rudro's own admission, are really, really high up there, these orders are likely to be higher level of public scrutiny to it. So it's easier to understand what the president was saying and find out what the president was saying, even if it is in a situation room, even if it's like sort of confidential, than to figure out what people in Africa, in some like random part of Sudan, were saying while they were raping like those 100 women that they just raped in Congo like about 3 weeks back, right? We think that's important to understand. If you have any POS, I take you now.
No.
Amazing. Now, the last question of this debate. Once we have said, what kind of emotions does war bring out? Which is what Nigam was asking. It brings out not the best emotions, right? Because let them not get away with the assumption that emotions and morality are the same thing. That apparently emotions make you do good things. Let us understand that all the bad things that we have done till now, as personal individuals, as a society, have been due to negative emotions. And emotions can be really, really screwed up when they're in a situation of war. When there are bullets flying around, when your basic flight or fight responses are triggered, where self-preservation, that is the fear of death, is so high. We think in those kind of situations, the kind of emotions you bring out are really, really bad for not only people around you, but also for people who have no power and come from the opposing forces. I'm talking about collateral damage, I'm talking about innocent women and children here. We also tell you on the last idea, the good emotions that they like to talk about, of patriotism and of heroism. We think on patriotism first and foremost, nobody is asking you not to be patriotic till the day you join the army, but once you join the army, we would rather that you leave your lived experience behind, your lived experience that my father was killed in the same war and a Muslim man did something to me and he happened from Pakistan. We want you to leave all of that baggage behind. Come as fresh slate. We will teach you what you can do or not do when we give you a gun in the hand. That's our stance. We don't see why that's problematic. Because we think heroism is really, really bad. Heroism in war makes you do bad things. They're likely to make you not take orders which tell you to retreat or to stay put. They're likely to make you act like a hero and like not follow the orders that you've been given because you think the commanders are too slow or you think the commanders are doing something that you don't agree with. We don't want individual agency in a point of war. We would rather that people fight as robots. We are proud to propose this case. Thank you.
I thank the government for that speech. They invite to inside opposition to summarize their case.
Whoa!
Sorry.
No, the only easy is point of start with that.
Mr. Speaker, two questions in this debate. The first, is it possible to instill a code of ethics when there are no emotions? That is, where does morality come from exactly? And the second, on which side is a more humane war more likely? But before I move on to answering these questions, let's deal with a little bit of what Mainak said, right? Firstly, there's a case shift from first to third speaker when he's telling you that commanders will have emotions in his third speech, but in the beginning I told you that, I mean in the first speech and the third speech I said that commanders also on the ground will not have emotions, right? So due to this case shift which came in government whip, we're not able to deal with a large part of their case to begin with, right? But secondly, we tell you that brutal warfare is oftentimes determined by command on the field itself, right? They say that hatred drives these brutal war crimes, but we tell you that hatred and otherization takes place not just on the field itself. That's a very idealistic assumption to make, but propaganda defines this hatred. What we learn in their training schools defines this hatred, and not just on the ground, right? We tell you that based on the top brass of a particular army, is what defines what the soldiers' code of ethics will be, or what the soldiers will learn themselves, right? So we tell you that Assad soldiers aren't going to be taught the Geneva Convention, and if the KKK tomorrow decides to have an army to like fight the blacks or whatever, they aren't going to be taught a very ethical thing to do in such situations, right? And I believe that's really important to recognize in this debate. That based on the top, we do not want whatever subjective change or whatever little change that soldiers on the ground could have made, to be taken away in this context. So to answer the first question, is it possible to instill a code of ethics when there are no emotions? We tell you it is not possible to instill a code of ethics when there are no emotions, because emotions inform where your morality comes from, right? They on side government have made this assumption that you will be a blank slate once your emotions are taken away, and whatever code of ethics exists can then be instilled in you so well that it also begins to define you as a person. We tell you that's really not true. Why? Because without emotions, how will you even choose between what your commander is telling you to do and your ethics, right? It's also likely that Nigam's point about criticism of war practices will take place better on their side. Tell you it's really not true. Because let's take them as a best case scenario, because if you really are hardwiring these ethics into them, you're also probably hardwiring this lesson that you aren't going to be able to criticize who your command is, you aren't going to be able to criticize what war practices are, right? If they believe that it's possible to instill certain ethics, we also believe that it's possible to instill these certain rules which do not allow them to then move beyond it, right? But also, Speaker, we tell you that 4 years of training also instills a certain obedience to command along with this ethics, right? So in that situation when you aren't informed by your emotions, how they haven't explained, are you then going to choose between what your commander is telling you and between your code of ethics? We believe that this is where emotions become crucially necessary to deciding what you can do. But before I move on, Mainak.
Finally, if we choose not to give this technology to the KKK, do you support our case?
Mr. Speaker, it's kind of a ridiculous question to take one example and make the debate entirely about that. We will not support the case in any scenario because of everything that our first two speeches have told you about to begin with, and it's not fair for them to ignore that, right? But let's move on to what else we've heard from them. Like I told you, they're still human, and removing their emotions doesn't mean you can imprint a new psyche in them, right? The commanders are still in control of their soldiers' morality, and we believe on our house that prevention of war crimes is much better than the prosecution of war crimes, which is what they seem to be going for, and it's going to be much easier to prosecute these people. But more importantly, on which side is a more humane